So when you were here 2 weeks ago, we talked about we were going to have a troubleshooting API that was going to handle all of the Istio commands that currently use the Debug API, an implementation that was unsharded, allowing anyone who knew the REST endpoint of IstioD to talk to it with or without Kubernetes, and also integration with Kubernetes aggregation so that we could very easily get this data no matter where your pods were running. We found that our proposal was very similar in spirit, if not in design, to Costin's proposal for XDS events. Now, Costin's XDS events, somewhat a wrapper of using XDS on other things. Those things are somewhat undefined, and we will get to that. But Costin and I had a meeting with Mitch and environments yesterday to talk about that. He challenged us to use his new API. Does that sound like a fair summary, Mitch?
Yeah, I think so. In particular, he was interested in the commands that we were not targeting, the ones that require access to the proxy and how we run those, which we weren't planning on doing in 1.7, but they seem to be a higher priority for the networking and working environments working groups.
So he had a number of ideas, and I've tried to write those down. I may not have completed it, and I wanted to sort of get everyone's thoughts about that. So I think the main goal that, one of his main goals was to reduce our dependency, our Istio dependency on IstioD debug and on Kubernetes, especially, so both Kubernetes in general and then admin ability on Istio system. And that means an almost total rework of the way that most of the commands are done. The output can stay the same, perhaps, but the sort of method of getting the data from the control plane is going to be different. And my thought is that it's so different, we don't even dare try to rewrite the commands in a single PR, that we almost certainly have a PR to add the new ways and have them experimental and then see if they're working. I tried to write down a style guide for the things that Costin sort of asked for. So let me show you what I think he said. First, he had a user experience concept that I think is a good one. We should start anyway, that the output of Istio should cover a mesh rather than a single cluster. So if you're in a multi-cluster single mesh environment and you ask it for proxy status, it should probably list all of the pods and not just the ones on some cluster you're connected to.
I think rather than the term mesh there, Ed, maybe we should say an entire control plane, right? That's what you say down in the clarifying bullet below.
That makes sense. So the idea is to see if we can do that. Of course, this brings up the possibility that there might be some ambiguous things. The default namespace in cluster 1 and the default namespace in cluster 2 are different namespaces. Currently, all of our reports just list the pod in the namespace. We might need a new column, but that's the basic idea. And the second point is that these things may not even require Kubernetes. So, for example, we might just not have to ask Kubernetes where a pod is or where Istio is, and we might take parameters to find them so that Istio can talk directly to sidecars or to central IstioD. Central IstioD is the word we use when IstioD is running sort of outside the control plane of your, or outside your cluster, managing multiple systems, either on some other Kubernetes cluster or completely independently of any Kubernetes cluster you know anything about. The other thing that I had never heard him pressed hard on before was that we should not just be letting our commands stay the way they are, but we should be decreasing the sort of decreasing the making them less coupled with the implementation. So the suggestion was, instead of going to these debug APIs and expecting the debug APIs to continue being supported by Pilot, and then we have trouble if they stop supporting something, we should follow these things, which are maybe more stable. The pod metrics, this new mechanism that we'll talk about of getting XDS events, possibly, and this seems to be contentious, if there are no pods, some way of finding this XDS event mechanism. We should be looking at Kubernetes config maps to see how Istio was installed for things like version. And we should be talking to the pod if we have to as a last resort, and really only doing debug for things where there's no other way. And we should remove all those if we can.
I think that last point, Ed, is the most important point from Costin and John's perspective. We need to do this from the perspective that either there is no control plane or we have no access to the control plane outside of what our Envoy sidecars in a particular namespace. And the motivation here is manifold, really, but the primary idea is that we can use, oh, hey, John Howard joined, so he might be able to speak for himself here. But I think that the primary motivation is that an administrator who only has access to his namespace, let's say the book info namespace, can get debug information about his namespace. The way that we do that is by more or less ignoring the existence of the control plane and getting as much debug information as we can from Istio agent there that you've already got access to.
I should add that up to the design point, that we should really separate out the Istio features that require admin access versus the features that require access to the book info namespace. And that, having that as a separate concern will let us sort of make sure that we don't put too much power into a command that maybe doesn't really need it. And so the good news is that Costin has already implemented XDS event reporting, which is wonderful, and it may be even ready to merge. The trouble item is that it currently seems to just be an envelope, unless I'm missing something. So he talks about, now that we have this, there's going to be topics. And he says there'll probably be these topics and maybe some others. But I haven't found, and I haven't looked yet at the full PR, but in this design doc, he doesn't say what the topics are. We need to see if 0 or more of these topics are in the first PR. He says they're coming in phase 2. And then if there's anything we need to add them and get them implemented under this mechanism. So something like proxy status might be able to work perfectly with NACs and connections, assuming that they do what I think they do. But maybe some other commands like authz, which sort of tells if mutual TIAS is going to be used. Maybe there isn't a topic yet for that. And we need to see how that, if that should be added as a new topic, or if there's a way to get it from some other topic. That seems to be the piece that we're sort of lacking in terms of knowing its timeline and what he wants and what that working group is going to be implementing.
So how does this, so I better understand kind of how the implementation works. Could you kind of go through how a proxy status would work in this architecture? Because we're going to need to know not just the Envoy, not just the pilot or IstioD that Envoy is connected to. We're going to need to know all of them, right?
Yes. So there's a great picture here, and I must admit that I don't understand it. So Here we see multiple IstioDs, 4 of them, acting as shards, and we see them talking to each other, and we see them communicating via these gateways. What Costin seemed to say was that somewhere in this picture is an endpoint that knows about all of the events within a few seconds that could give us an unsharded view. Hopefully that's true, and then we would just sort of talk to that. If that's not true, we're sort of screwed, because the whole reason that we have so many dependencies on Kubernetes now is we have to walk through each of the IstioDs and ask it things. We don't want to do that now. We want to use this architecture to get everything from one place.
Well, not necessarily from one place, right? Like we'd be talking to the proxy, but for anything that we do need control plane and information from, for that we're effectively talking back to the control plane, right?
Right. So a command like proxy config, we can just ask Envoy, what's your current config? And it'll tell us, and then we're done. No need to talk to the control plane at all. For a command like proxy status, if it's the proxy status of a single pod, we can say, hey pod, tell us what your STOD is, and then we'll ask it, has this pod been acting the way it should? Is there a difference between what it currently has versus what you last got an ACK in response? The other command like proxy status with no argument that is supposed to return all of the pods needs the view of all of the pods in a mesh known to that control plane revision. Or we stop having that command. And it may be that some commands we no longer use. One of the frustrations is we don't really know what our users are using. There's some commands that sort of have been in experimental, have never graduated. No one's asking us to graduate them. Maybe we should get rid of them. There's other commands we don't really know who's using it. So if anyone has an idea for 1.7 or 1.8 for how we can find out what commands people are really using, that would be great. I don't know how to do that in a way that is private, other than asking people.
And I've had some thoughts on ways that we could collect that information and continue respecting privacy. My concern is I feel like I need someone to sign off on it. Anytime we're tracking data about users, that's a big change from previous iterations, from previous policy within the Istio project. Maybe it's something that we should ask the TOC about, but at a high level, if we essentially hash the command that they're running and then run a Google search for that command in the background, we can use Google Analytics to track the trend of that hash, and we'll see how many people are running that command. And because it's Google Analytics, it's available to everyone, it's already anonymized and all that.
Well, that's interesting. I thought of something lower level, like just having a cuddle stats file that you could report a bug that might have said you used proxy status 10,000 times and proxy config twice. But whatever it is, if anyone has the time to work on something, one thing that's been frustrating is not knowing where our group should put our efforts. But for 1.7, I think that might be out of scope. For 1.7, the big thing is this central STOD notion is coming. We certainly in multi-cluster single mesh, you're going to have people who have only access to a particular cluster cannot port forward in. So the big security improvement that we've already implemented, John Howard did for us, is that we don't exec into the Istio system anymore. We just port forward in. That's great. But we want to get rid of even that. We don't want to require anyone using Istio to be able to enumerate pods or port forward into Istio system. And they might not even have an Istio system because they're using an Istio control plane that's provided by a vendor, azure.istio.com or something. So we need to redesign all of our Istio internals to be able to at least optionally work with that. And I talked a lot with Costin about different techniques of how to do that. I'm not sure that's appropriate for this meeting, which I want to be about sort of signing off on this roadmap. So, so let me talk about sort of what I want us to agree on so that I can present this to the TOC for part 2 of our roadmap presentation. One is I want to eliminate or reduce our dependency on the debug API of Istio and on Kubernetes itself for listing pods. I haven't exactly said how much, hopefully 100%, and get a P1 primary, but not a must ship. If there's some command that still does it, we can deprecate that command, keep it in. How does that sound to people?
I like it, Ed.
I'll put a to-do to make a work item that says that. So I have this style guide, which we can go through later on in the call. And if there's anything dumb in there, we can get rid of it. For P0s, for this new approach, I have one P0 that's just to give a control plane address. This is for the case where you maybe don't have a Kubernetes and you just want to say, you know, my Istio is running at this address. This could be a local tunnel set up to a VM that's running IstioD, or it could be a cloud service. Do we think this is reasonable to sort of have?
And to clarify, that's an override, right? By default, we would have the same way of detecting the control plane address, but you can override that and connect to an arbitrary control plane address with that flag.
Right. So the technique of how to find IstioD, if you supply this, that's where it is. The question is, though, if you don't supply this, how to find it. And I mentioned several things, and we should talk about them. In fact, I probably should mention it here, because I think it's important enough how to find IstioD. One is this P0 to explicitly say it, but that's just an internal debugging feature that I don't think people will use. The other is to find it the old way, which is look in Istio system for IstioD or Istio agent and ask the question mark. The other is a local Istio config file, which would contain YAMLs sort of saying where my control planes are. Are there any of these that we think are, or which direction do we think we should go in this case where the user doesn't have access to Istio system, is not an administrator of their cluster?
Do you think that this level of detail is something that the TOC is going to want to hear for the roadmap?
They may not want to hear it, but I want to hear what we want to do so that I can sort of say it. And, you know, when I went into yesterday into a meeting with Costin, I'm like, well, look, we could put it here. We could put it here. Maybe we could even start up a pod and look at its config. We could do this. It was felt this was too low level, so maybe it shouldn't be here, but we sort of need to do it. So I'll just make a P0 new way to find IstioD. That works with central or, and I'll take these items and put them into the style guide. And I'm happy to implement this. So it's similar stuff for new defined envoy. Although I'm going to want, and I'm happy to write the code. I want to, make sure everyone on this team, everyone on this call, especially Liam, who's doing a lot of VM stuff, make sure that I don't design something stupid to find it.
Maybe this is me being too new, but what does the user get? What is the benefit for the user with a new way to find Istio?
So the benefit to the user is none if the user has installed Istio in the current way. When a user installs Istio, Istio is running an Istio system. The user who installed it has admin authority over his cluster, so he had permission to do it, and he has permission to call Istio where he has installed it. The problem is that in 1.7, networking has proposed that Istio not need to run in the Istio system namespace or even on the cluster at all, which means that when 1.7 hits, Istio cut will not work unless there is a new way. So the hope is to come up with a way that works both with people who have installed themselves in the 1.6 way and who are using an out of control plane way, such as central SDOD or single control plane multi-cluster configurations.
Okay, thank you.
So for these items, we've made P0s and assigned to myself, so that, or at least these myself. The style guide is, I'm going to say, 2 perhaps, and it's just going to be to make as many things as possible, or P1 to use these new styles so that we don't have this trouble. These other items are the things that we agreed on 2 weeks ago. Istio Cuddle Manifest Remove, which I will be doing the CLI stuff for, with Martin doing the operator stuff. These multi-control plane improvements, some of these very much overlap with the stuff we've just talked about. Making proxy status work better if we don't know the revision is very similar to making proxy status work if we don't know where STOD is. Commands to list the control planes might be different depending on if we decide that we want to have a config file the way kubectl does, or if we want to have some things on the cluster like a manifest of control planes. These items are pretty much unchanged from what we discussed 2 weeks ago. The other thing that I want to get this group to sign off on is these items, which had been P0, this troubleshooting API, I want to push to 1.8 and make it just be P2 for this release. And whether it gets pushed and in what format, I don't know about these musts. So we almost want to get rid of these musts. I think they're actually recorded in this work item. I mean, if so, maybe we can get them out of here so we don't confuse the TOC when they look at this.
So wait, are we pursuing this as a P2 in 1.7, or are we pursuing it in 1.8?
Well, so P2 means just we don't have to do it. But I think what I propose is that for 1.7, we just think about the design and make a Go package to be ready for it. We'll probably want to put the code that we're writing for these new styles of finding STOD and the current commands in a package, and I'm just going to suggest making that package general enough that we could put stuff on top of it that would be a troubleshooting API. What do you think?
Well, in pursuing the proxy commands before the control plane commands, I'm a little bit concerned that we're building a lot in an area that we don't have a good deal of understanding. This is something that you and I became aware of 24 hours ago. We're also building it on top of a design doc that is not approved yet and is being implemented as experimental in 1.7. I feel like we're building a lot on a very uncertain foundation here.
So should we reduce it to less than P2?
Well, no, actually the troubleshooting API, like for the central commands, I think we have a better understanding of how those are going to work, at least.
Okay.
I'm more concerned with the proxy level command, so maybe we split it out and call it out. What would you think?
Too much weight into this eventing thing that Costin has. The eventing is just a small part that would help implement like the proxy status command only. All the other stuff like proxy config is already supported today, and the eventing stuff is actually a very small change to add. So I don't think it's too high risk.
Okay. So when you say proxy status is the only one that needs eventing, that's not the understanding I left the meeting with yesterday with. Can you elaborate there?
The eventing sends events about connections, disconnects, that sort of thing, which is what proxy status needs. Things like proxy config, they just need the envoy config, right? That's already supported. That's not eventing, that's just normal XDS generation, which is like what Pilot does, basically. So that's certainly not going away ever.
Well, we have other commands like kubectl wait things that look at these various debug endpoints. Let me see if I can bring up the chart for that. So I went through the commands as part of this exercise. This is most of the commands, maybe not all the experimental ones, whether they talk to Kubernetes, the pods envoy, or the control plane. So proxy status talks to control plane. Verify install might talk to it just to make sure it's healthy. Version talks to the control plane, and describe talks to the control plane. And I believe wait talks to the control plane. So those certainly all need to be reworked for this mechanism.
Yeah, well, and in addition, we had talked about putting analysis information as well as distribution status information into this new control plane level API, which, John, I think was actually a requirement from you for moving forward with status, was that we would be able to support multiple control planes, multiple clusters, etc. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure what status. I don't get the connection. I may have missed something.
So in 1.6, the things that we added for status, including background analysis information, as well as distribution status, writes to Kubernetes CRDs. That only works for one control plane per cluster. If you have two logical control planes, two revisions running within a cluster, then one of them is going to need to write status and the other should not. In order to access status information from the secondary control plane that is not writing it to Kubernetes, we'll need some other API, and this is where we were going to be doing that.
Have all the status stuff, but you're not actually writing it to the status objects.
Exactly. Same data, just not written to Kubernetes, accessed directly.
Oh, you're talking about the config map stuff. So Istio is connecting to the other Istio.
No.
Isn't the whole point of status to put it into the CRD though?
So for situations where there is only one control plane, or where you're in the primary control plane within a cluster, that totally makes sense. One of the pieces of pushback we received that you needed to be able to see status data from the secondary cluster. For instance, if you're upgrading, your primary is writing to status, your canary is not. So you want to see what sort of view of status the canary has, which is going to be different than the primary. That would be done through this control plane level API.
So I guess we now have an idea of the scope of what we're sort of being asked. And I think the people on this call have sort of agreed to the changes I made to this roadmap. Is there anything else that you think we should definitely add or remove from this roadmap before we show it to the TOC?
One thing I would like to add on the multiple control plane was to move analysis to Istio instead of relying on Gadi. So that way we can use the current status controller mechanism to report status for both analysis and config distribution.
Jason, when you say that, do you mean not relying on MCP?
Well, analyze doesn't rely on MCP, right? So basically move the entire, right now what we do is we bring up Gadi, well, like the Gadi pipeline when we run analyze.
MCP, right?
Oh, is it MCP or is, I don't think it's MCP.
Well, okay, yeah, I guess we're probably saying the same thing in different words. Yeah, okay. So that means that nothing would use MCP anymore, right? We could delete that entire code base.
I'm not sure about Istio. It will dependent on Istio analyze implementation. The scope I'm thinking is still like in cluster analysis.
The same code base.
So
Istio analyze and
this would allow us to clean up a lot of the Galley code base that is not related to Istio analyze today. But there will still be some that is left that it will be required for that until we have some way within Istio of ingesting config from files.
So would it just be the file? So my understanding is that the Istio analyze and the analysis pipeline are very similar. So is it just the file reading that we need, or is it the entire MCP stack with all the transformations, the
it will be everything, right? Like from the source to processing.
leading like 50,000 lines of code? That would be awesome.
Well, technically, yes. So I think that's a big project, but yeah. But I think it will be good, beneficial for us to accomplish that.
Good.
Yeah, and I can add that to the, or if you're already adding, I can add that to the doc.
So I think the next point is going to be to figure out exactly which debug APIs are being in use by each of the various Istio commands and seeing if we can get rid of them. So one of my frustrations with the debug API is that since only Istio was using it, it broke. So Istio describe used to tell you not only whether your pod had strict or permissive TLS, but whether by default clients of it would use strict or would use TLS or plain text. And that feature of debug telling us which clients we're going to be using was sort of broken when we went from the old style authorization to the peer authorization. That kind of brittleness is a problem, and when my question for getting rid of debug is both how do we know, how can we make the things that we used to have in debug either be gone or that we can use so that when this happens we can sort of tell, and if they are being fixed, are they being fixed through these topics in the event API, like when a destination rule is created that sort of tells us whether TLS will be used or not? What sort of mechanisms do we want to say? Costin's first proposal, the one that is being implemented, seems more like the envelope than the contents of the API.
So at I think that whatever we do in terms of debug APIs, both in the proxy side and on the control plane side, need necessarily to involve extensive test coverage. We can call that out as a separate line item, but if we so much as implement those Istio commands in integration tests, those sorts of breaking changes should be caught right away.
I think that's going to be great. You know, one of the big problems we had before 1.6 was that we had all these unit tests that had checked in Envoy configurations. So we never saw, because we lacked integration test coverage on some of these things, what was supposed to happen. So definitely all of the new commands are going to need an integration test that needs to be performant. And that's going to be especially important for some of these multi-cluster, central STOD things. And I should probably ask if anyone on this call knows, when we run integration tests, will there be an integration test for a sort of out of cluster STOD so that we can make sure all of our stuff works in all those cases? What sort of deployment architectures are going to be available in integration tests?
There is a multi-cluster deployment architecture that's available today. I don't remember whether that runs with a shared control plane or with a replicated control plane. I think actually you can configure it. John, do you know offhand? He must be doing something else. So we do support multiple clusters within the test framework, and I think that should be able to simulate pretty effectively a central STOD situation. Obviously, the central STOD itself is not something we specifically support in the integration test because it doesn't exist yet.
That makes sense. Maybe we can check in some stubs for where this testing is supposed to go so we can start trying it out.
Yeah, the stubbing is available today, and test plans will be required for any designs we write anyways. So it doesn't hurt to get an early start on that.
Okay.
Ed, do you think that that's important enough that we should call it out as its own item on the roadmap?
Yes, the test plan is going to be super important, so let's put it there.
Yeah, I'm thinking, especially if we're looking at multiple releases before we're able to get to our desired state for these debug operations, setting up tests for what exists today from the get-go will help us not break ourselves as we iterate.
Could you also add Costin's design doc for the eventing stuff to the meeting notes? So I can give that a read.
I'll take care of that.
Thanks.
So I've added to P0, which I think is going to be all of us who are writing these commands. So certainly myself, Mitch, probably Liam for anything that is related to VMs or VM-specific commands. So I'm just going to pencil you in there, Liam. That everything, these new commands that we write that find the data different ways and find Istio different ways, be tested as integration.
Sounds reasonable. I think I just need to sit down and read through Costin's thing so I get a better understanding of like how it actually works, so then I can level set and make decisions.
Yeah, I scanned it. I want to read it again. My comment was I really wanted to see an example of how to invoke it and not just an example of what it's going to do, what topics it's going to have. You know,
Well, Costin has agreed. Remember, Costin agreed yesterday that he was going to come back with a written example of what I think Istio cuddle weight would look like using XDS eventing.
yeah, and I think I added a question for him to do that for something else, maybe proxy status. So that should be good enough. If it gets merged, I can just start using gRPC curl to try it out. He also said he might offer it as HTTP in addition to gRPC. And we would have to decide which one of those we want to use. So I sprung a lot of new stuff on everyone during this meeting, and I made everyone look at this roadmap that we need to get approved. Probably we should take some time to sort of think about why we're doing it all and why Costin wants us to do it this way and why that's going to make things better for our users. We're very much still just trying to keep above water with changes that are coming to networking and keeping everything working. With 1.6, we didn't really create a better user experience, but just allowed multiple control planes to have a command line. And with 1.7, it looks like we may be in a similar cycle, that we're just trying to get all of our existing commands to support these new things that are coming down the road for central Istio and XDS eventing. It would be ideal to talk about some other things, and I tried to come up with a style guide to represent both our thoughts and the thoughts that networking has for what we should do. So the first one was that we should be thinking about making things cover the entire control plane. So going back really and taking our commands, which were cluster based in Istio 0 and Istio 1, and be thinking about, if Istio 2 is very much based on not clusters, but a multi-cluster single control plane, how that would look. And the other item that Costin really wanted, and we also have not done the homework on, and we should kick ourselves for not doing it, is separating out the features that require admin access versus the features that just require access to the workload namespace. So we're no longer in a world where people have their own Kubernetes clusters. People who are running microservices in production have access to the whole cluster. There's a lot more multi-tenant or RBAC stuff in place. We want to be thinking about both our implementation, taking as few permissions as possible, but just the structure of the commands. If there are commands that are for a user to debug problems with their own pods versus the commands that, say, one of us who's a developer on Core Istio is using to debug a personal build of Istio D. How can we separate those out? Do we have any thoughts on that, on the structure of sort of how our commands are. And probably that same kind of breakdown is going to be needed for an API like the one Mitch is talking about as well. You know, some features, for the features most people expect in an API are the features for debugging their own pods, but occasionally you need to debug Pilot itself as well. If you don't have thoughts now, make comments on this document over the coming days. So I should probably mention, since we have another few minutes, I think it's worth discussing some other thoughts I had that I maybe showed Costin, but maybe haven't shown everyone here and should have. Wrong picture. Hang on, I actually maximized this in the wrong space. Let me stop sharing. Am I sharing?
No.
All right. Let me start sharing properly. So I have this model that I have been thinking about of how users interact in a complicated world. This is the model that I internally use when I'm thinking about it. I'm imagining one user. So first, let me imagine that there's 3 clusters. There's some clusters have an Istio-D running an Istio system on the cluster. Other clusters have Istio-D running outside the cluster as a service. There's an advanced user I'll call Nuth, after the famous professor. He's administering production. He is administering the Istio system namespace on cluster 3. There's a beginner, junior called Bob who's administering some other things. How can I get both of these users to have a good experience with Istio, to know what they have, know that they have some central Istio-Ds that they've paid for and have used, to know that they have some Istio-Ds they've installed themselves. How can I allow them to work together to do things together? Nuth is administering the Istio system that Bob is using. We've never had a Istio config before, because we've always used a Kubernetes kube config to find the clusters that Istio talks to. And I realized that if Istio-D is running outside of a cluster, we might want a kube config. This is just a straw man for how one might look. But let's think about this and come back in 2 weeks if we think this is right. I'll make a publicly editable version of this and put it in the Slack for everyone to see. But the idea is maybe we have a list of control planes, some of which have public endpoints just on the internet with security. Maybe we have other Istio-Ds that have their own names. This Istio-D is named cluster 3, but it runs on cluster 3. It's found by pods and deployments there. Would this be useful? I was imagining a sort of user in this system. He's administering multiple systems, having a command to list which control planes he has access to, both the ones he's paying for and the canaries he's running himself. If you start canarying control planes, it becomes hard to remember what you've got. Maybe one guy's installed the canary, another guy's testing it, and tomorrow one of them is going to be promoted or rolled back. A command like use context, a command to add a central Istio-D, a command to add an Istio control plane that we've just installed locally, and sort of how can we do that? Commands to delete. Do we think that Istio deserves commands like this in the complex world that we've been promising people with canaries and remote control planes? I didn't want this much complexity, but it seems like networking has purchased this much complexity, and now we must support it.
And so would these be, I know we looked at these yesterday. When we talk about changing the context of which control plane you're connecting to, are we talking only about debug commands, or are there other instructions that care about where the control plane is?
So we have two kinds of commands, sort of the install, remove, managing of a Istio system. Maybe Kubernetes context completely. Maybe installing Istio only adds it to this list. Maybe adding a canary only adds it to this list. Then we have this idea that we're going to roll back or roll forward a canary and make it be the master for a plane. And that sort of affects this list as well, right? I want to promote my canary to master. Then we have this idea, well, I'm running some, my company's provided me, they've purchased a Istio control plane that's being administered remotely. And I'm sort of kicking the tires, I'm trying it out, and I've forgotten what I've done. These commands sort of tell you the same way that, you know, the kubectl config commands tell you which clusters you've been talking to lately. For me, I keep 3 clusters, and on those clusters I keep 2 meshes. And so for me, it's been pretty easy and to keep track of, I do canary deployments for testing. General user, I think it's too difficult.
Makes sense.
So think about yourself. If you ever get stuck with this, would you want this? And if so, we can put it in. Currently, the way that Istio talks to Pilot, the thing that we need to remove because it doesn't work with Central IstioD, is that we used to exec into IstioD enumerating the pods. Now we're port forwarding in, thanks to John, which speeds things up, but still requires all of this stuff. And what I showed Costin was, well, if IstioD is on a public endpoint, we can just talk to it on a flat network or go through our VPN. If IstioD, though, is running on a cluster, we can't easily reach it. We don't have a VPN into a Kubernetes cluster, so we would want to port forward to it the sort of way we already have. But you can only port forward to a single pod. And since I want to port forward to the uncharted view, maybe if every IstioD has an uncharted view, it's fine to port forward into any IstioD and ask it the things that we need to do for troubleshooting. But if not, we need some kind of pilot agent or IstioCuddlD there to forward things in. And those are the kind of questions that we need to get answered very quickly to make sure that what we get for 1.7 is sufficient for everything that 1.7 provides from a networking point of view. Make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Objections? Will it work in the tetrate use case, Liam? In the case of tetrate, will it be possible to have IstioCuddle just knowing where Istio is and eliminate the need to talk to Kubernetes at all to talk to it?
I think our use case is slightly different, and it depends on how we evolve and how we use multi-cluster in our products. So, like, I don't think I can really give you an answer yet until I better understand like the event stuff and everything else.
Okay, maybe next meeting in 2 weeks you can sort of tell us how you think in your architecture you will be talking to this event stuff if it is sufficient for your needs.
Sounds good.
We can make that happen, and that the people who are writing things don't break anything that you've added for your use cases.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, well, we've reached the top of the hour. Do we have anything else?
Thanks, Ed, for reacting so quickly to the feedback.
No problem. If you have anything that you want to present in 2 weeks, or agenda items that you want me to present, just add them to our agenda. Otherwise, I will start trying to make stuff happen for 1.7. Okay, thank you, everyone.
See you, Ed.